It is my pleasure to welcome you to a very exciting panel. First of all, of course, because of the topic, but also because of the very interesting people. It is now 2018, and in 2008, we published Profiling the European Citizen, an edited volume where I think around 20 computer scientists, lawyers, philosophers, and social scientists wrote about what was then called knowledge discovery in databases, KDD, big data, algorithms, and the more. We are now talking about machine learning and, of course, about deep learning. We are moving from the difference between online and offline to what some people have called the on-life world. And basically everything is getting to be data-driven, from data-driven web applications to cloud robotics, and I'm not talking about fake news, Sophia, to cyber-physical infrastructures like smart grids, connected cars, road systems that are also part of our critical infrastructure. So this panel is going to focus on data-driven healthcare and data-driven medicine. And I want to quote to you a statement from Geoffrey Hinton, one of the people who invented sort of deep learning, who said, I think it was mid-2016, we should stop training radiologists. And I want to briefly put that opposite the work of Federico Cabizza, who's a specialist in medical informatics and who warns exactly against these types of visions on what this type of technology can and cannot do. And I want to throw in the middle of the panel, that's why I'm looking at my phone, a tweet in the middle of a thread that I saw this morning on Twitter from Federico Cabizza. One of his arguments is that while these machines supposedly get better, which depends on what computer scientists call the ground truth, and I'm sure somebody will explain what that is, that as we think that they outperform domain specialists like medical doctors and radiologists, these medical specialists might de-skill, and there are dangers in that. So he tweeted this morning, to save a few lives, we can't allow to jeopardize many others by allowing machines to de-skill practitioners or make them focus more on what is datafiable and slowly forget what the machine can't see. I think that's a nice provocative thing to throw in the middle of this panel. And the last thing I will do is introduce our moderator, Julie Brill, who of course doesn't need an introduction, but I will still do it. She's Corporate Vice President and Deputy General Counsel for Global Privacy and Regulatory Affairs at Microsoft. From April 2016 to mid-2017, she was working at a law firm, and before that she served as Commissioner of the FTC, the Federal Trade Commission in the United States. I'm still going to quote, Brill was named the Commission's most important voice on internet privacy and data security issues, a key regulator, not just on a national but also on an international stage, as well as one of the top minds in online privacy. She's now getting embarrassed. One of the top 4 US government players leading the privacy debate and a game changer. So we're very happy to have her here as a moderator.
Thank you, that's very sweet. So, is this on? Yes, I think so. Is it loud enough? Can you guys hear me? So I'm super excited about this panel. We have some really great speakers. So what I'd like to do is just dive right in. And so we can hear from them. We'll ask a few questions after a couple of them, and then when they're all done, we'll start having more of a conversation, and lastly, open it up to you, and then turn the floor back to our fabulous chair, Mireille. All right. So first we have Professor Benanti, who will be speaking about his research and his thoughts about the ethics of AI. After Professor Benanti, we will have Jim Dratwa, who is with the European Commission. He is the head of the European Group on Ethics in Science and New Technology. Then we will have my dear friend Rich Caruana, who is from Microsoft. He is a Microsoft researcher and a former professor at wonderful universities. And then last but very far from least, we will have Brent Mittelstadt, who is a research fellow at Oxford University. So Professor Benanti, will you please begin? Thank you.
Thank you very much. If it's possible to start the slide, thank you. Now, approaching to ethical governance of artificial intelligence is an hard task. What I would like to stress during this short presentation is what is the role of ethics in technology? Because one of the first bias that we could have is ethics like something that is a chain that constrains the development of technology. Is that true? If we look at what happened 70,000 years ago, when human being, Homo sapiens, spreads around the world, we have to notice a big difference between the other mammals. For example, when a mammoth moves itself from the north of Europe to Africa and to Asia, he has to wait a generation that has a different DNA to adapt himself to different environment. When 70,000 years ago we moved to the north, we moved all around the world, we didn't wait for a generation with long barb, but we dress ourselves with the skin of a mammoth. So the artifact of technology is the way in which our race, our human being nature, transmit to the other generation our knowledge and competence on the world. Ethics is deeply rooted in that. What we can do or what we cannot do, what we know or what we don't know is transmitted to a technological artifact. This human condition has to be considered if we would like to draft an ethical of artificial intelligence that is really rooted to what this kind of technology is. Now, what is the specificity of artificial intelligence among the technological artifacts that we know? Artificial intelligence is something that is based on data, on power of calculation, and is based about a representation of the world, of the real world, that is made by data. So according to what the data is, or data are, is just a map of the real world. And sometimes we hear that ethics in artificial intelligence are connected to the low quality of data. Is that true? Now, is it possible to imagine a map of the world that has the exact amount of data that are in the world? Theoretically, yes. But a map that is the exact copy of the real world is simply useless because there are too much data. So we have to go through this with the Laplace demon. Laplace was used to say that if we know the position and the speed of all the particles of the world in one moment, we can know all the past, all the present, and know the future. The same thing could happen to the artificial intelligence. If we think that when we have a perfect map of the world, we can have perfect decision, we can imagine a perfect map, but we cannot have it. So ethical dimension in artificial intelligence is to take seriously that the data which operate with are not the exact copy of reality. And so it's possible or it's impossible to achieve a perfect choice by a machine. So ethical is deeply connected to this situation of our knowledge. Now, which kind of ethical drive has to be put on the stage when we talk about ethics? I can summarize it in three directions. The first one is fear of uncertainty. When we allow someone or something to take a decision, we are not 100% sure of what will happen. This kind of uncertainty has to be one of the first ethical drivers inside our ethical consideration. So there is a certain amount of uncertainty that has to guide us in developing guidelines that can make safe the human being and the person during this action. The second thing that we have to take care of is the result of our history. If you look at 18th century, 20th century, most bloody battle around the world is to say that every human being is equal and has the same right of other human beings. So equality is one of the first character of our society. New technology can simply develop new form of inequality. So equality and the grant of equality is another ethical driver that has to take place in our ethical consideration. The second thing is the ability of each one of us can pursue his happiness. So technology must be a way to allow each one of us to live in a society that allows us to follow our desire and to pursue our happiness. The third level of ethical driver are the policies. No rights, no values, no other things that we can consider valuable could really exist if we have no policy that guarantees this. So fear of uncertainty, equality and pursuit of happiness has to be protected and developed through policies. If this is the horizon of ethical values, now we have to transform this in a way in which data and machine can process it. So we need to develop a certain form of union between algorithm and ethics. I propose use this new word, Algor-ethics, to say that we have to develop some kind of algorithm that just not work with values of variables, but they work with values that are ethically balanced, ethically understood. Algor-ethics, so, is something that has to put computability with values. And this is the new framework in which philosophy, legal practitioners, and the other competence, the other knowledge of the world have to work together to develop a framework that is really something that could be applied. What we can understand as the first directive of this kind of algor-ethics? If it's impossible, theoretically impossible, to have a perfect decision by a machine, it's also theoretically impossible to think a machine that is independent by a human being, totally independent. I know very well we cannot go deeply inside this due to time limitation, that the media proposed as a machine and artificial intelligence are something that is versus human being. Think what happened when the Big Blue defeated Kasparov. Think what happened when Watson win Jeopardy. Machine defeat the human being. But is not this the model? The model is cooperative. And a cooperative model means that the machine should acquire some kind of grade of uncertainty about its results. Only putting this like the core ethical values, the core algor-ethics point in artificial intelligence, we will have a cooperative model in which the machine has a meaning to human being and give to the human being not a replacement of skills, as we heard in the statement before, but something that is cooperative, something that could augment the human being capability. Now, in which way we can simple draft more lines? To do that, let me do an example. Think a mixed environment in which augmented artificial intelligent machine could coexist with human being. Could we imagine 4 kinds of algorithmic ethical driver that we could implement to assure that the human dignity is safe in this environment? According to me, the first directive that we have to apply to this kind of environment is what we call anticipation. When I'm used to coexist to another human being and we work together, I'm able to understand from what he do if he needs some kind of help or what he's doing. So the machine has to acquire in an algorithmic way the ability to understand what the human being has as a meanings in his inaction and be cooperative with him. So this kind of cooperation in which the machine is able to understand what is my final object in my action is the first directive that could save the human dignity. The second thing is transparency. If you look, for example, at some robot arm that take an action, the robot arm is simply developed by an optimization of some kind of calculation to give the best speed and the best efficiency. But if you look me that I go with my arm to the bottle, you understand that I would like to pick the bottle. So the machine has to be transparent, has to communicate to the human side of the mixed environment what is his final goal. This kind of transparency allow in a mixed environment, that I remember you is the example in which I am applying the ethics in artificial intelligence. This kind of transparency has to be granted to allow machine and human being to cooperate and not to fight one against the others. Another thing is that in a cooperation between human being and machine, one side of the union is an emotional being. That means that I'm not just my reason. So supposing, let me give you an example, that I jump inside a self-driving car. If the self-drive car has learned to drive from the handbook, driver handbook, and you put this car inside a really chaotic city. I know well my city, Rome, Italy. It's really chaotic. I can jump in at 9 a.m., at 11:30 I'm still in the same place because the other driver do not follow the rules. And so I will be stressed, and slamming the door, I get out. Now, supposing that we have an algorithm that teaches to the machine to drive from the other driver. I could jump in at 9 a.m., 9:15, I call the police to save me. So again, I'm an emotional being. Machine has to learn that, and in this mixed cooperation, my uniqueness, my human dignity is safe if the machine can understand me and adapt himself to myself. Once again, the last one is the adequation. When you make an optimization to an algorithm, what we look for is the best result, the most efficient algorithm. But in a mixed reality, when I have my goals and the machine has its own goals, the machine has to set up what comes first and what comes later according to our coexistence. So we cannot just simply deploy a machine that is the best and most rapid machine to do something, because in a mixed reality, there is a changing of priority, and the machine has to adequate to the changing of this priority. So this short example is just a way in which we drafted the needed of an ethical in artificial intelligence, how this ethics is connected to a non-perfect choice, theoretically based, so it's an impossible perfect choice, and this uncertainty has to be the first ethical driver that suggests to the human being an intervention or the last call when things are not so sure, and then trying to apply that in a mixed environment with human being and machine. The human dignity has to be preserved through adequate algorithms that can calculate, estimate, and cooperate with the human side. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Jim, thank you.
Great. These work as well? Yes, they do. Excellent. Yeah, thanks ever so much, Julie. Yes, it's a tremendous pleasure and honor to be here. And responsibility deeply felt regarding this crucial set of issues. If we can move on to the next set of slides. That's great. Thanks so much. So yes, artificial intelligence, so many possibilities, and I'm talking here of artificial intelligence and robotics and algorithms, big data, big notch, autonomous systems, etc., the whole set. So with regard to ethics, a crucial question to reflect upon is what world? What world do we want to live in together? Okay, so fascinating. The set of slides has been changed a little bit?
I have not changed them.
Okay.
Sorry.
No worries at all. Yes, I see apparently it has been changed, but that's good. So we're gonna, just to avoid any surprises for anyone, we're just gonna do it without slides. Can you remove the slides? Can we take off the slides? Can we do that? Can someone do that?
There we go. What do we, is that?
No slides? Thanks so much. Great. as I was saying, key ethical question, what world do we want to live in together? And as I say this, I realize I said we. And saying we, it happens. And whenever it happens, we should just be mindful of who is in the we and who is not, and how is that determined. And really this, where are the others? That is another crucial question. Ethics is about the question of the good, and it is about reframing. Now, let's consider the two families of scenarios or dominant discourses on artificial intelligence. One scenario is the AI doomsday scenario. A world of AI technological singularity, artificial general intelligence, of intelligence explosion with its many variations, runaway AI, hostile AI, and the end of human life as we know it. And then we have the second story, AI for good, living in peace and harmony, open innovation, public participation, AI to solve our problems. And then there is also a third story. Let's call this scenario AI business as usual. Commodification, surveillance, oligopolies, difficulties with redistributive mechanisms, manipulation of choice structures, enhancement of inequalities, and exploitation of humanity as we know it. So this third possible story is not so good at grabbing headlines, but it also deserves our attention. Well, there are many possible stories with AI, but looking at these technologies, a key point to draw out is the structuring ambiguity. The ambiguity between empowerment and exploitation. The ambiguity between empowerment, participation, democratization, liberation, autonomy, betterment, fulfillment, flourishing, and exploitation, instrumentalization, control, subjection, commodification. But what happens when we cannot tell the difference? A very salient question which comes to the fore is this one. Will artificial intelligence and robots take our place? Stop training radiologists, Mireille was indicating. So one aspect of this relates to the AI doomsday. But deep down, this is about human-machine relations, questions of coexistence and hybridity. So, in full view, the question of will we control the AIs, or will the machines be controlling us? But also, who exerts power and control among humans in our world? So this is not just about human-centered perspective, but also about decentering, about what does it mean to be human, and what humanity do we want and do we not want in machines, in our constructions, in our relations. What we urgently need is a globally orchestrated joint effort to ensure that artificial intelligence is developed for the well-being of humanity and our planet. We need a set of ethical principles, of ethical safeguards, to make the most of those technological and societal transformations. And another point, these choices regarding technology and society cannot be made in some remote boardrooms or commission offices. We need a wide-ranging public deliberation on where it is we want to go. At the European Commission, President Juncker and Commissioner Moedas have asked the European Group on Ethics in Science and New Technologies to develop an opinion on the future of work, as well as a statement on the ethics of artificial intelligence and robotics. The statement will be issued by April, and the opinion by the summer. And in fact, should you be back in Brussels, or still be in Brussels on the 5th of February, just a few days from now, you're very warmly invited to the open round table on the future of work, the future of society, convened by the European Group on Ethics. Do not hesitate to check the website, and you're invited. So you can register, and we'll be delighted to have you there. As I said, a first step towards a responsible development of AI is the establishment of a set of fundamental principles to guide us in this process. And indeed, the European Group on Ethics statement on artificial intelligence and robotics will set out precisely such a set of principles on the ethics of artificial intelligence. It will also initiate a wide-ranging public deliberation on what is the artificial intelligence that we want. There are many ongoing initiatives, many stakeholders, and we need to work together. Really, what do we want our future to look like? What is the world that we want to leave to our children? Thanks for your consideration of those questions. Really, thanks.
Thank you so much, Jim. And I don't know what happened to your slides, but you did a fabulous job without them. So what I think we're going to do in order to make sure we give each of our speakers a chance to explain to you what they're thinking about is we're just going to jump right to Rich, who will go to his presentation now. Thanks.
Hi, so I'm a researcher in machine learning, so I know very little about policy and law. So I'm going to sort of jump in a little bit and tell you a story about some of the risks of AI. So a surprising number of people in my community, in the machine learning community, believe that if you train a deep neural net that's big enough, and you train it on enough data, and if the accuracy looks very, very good, perhaps even superhuman kind of accuracy, that it's actually safe to go ahead and deploy that model and use it in the real world. Now, sometimes this is absolutely the correct point of view, but there are a number of times and settings where this is actually quite risky, and I'm going to tell you about one or two of those settings. So now the reason why this is risky is maybe you've trained a neural net, and while this doesn't look very big, typical neural nets now might have 100 million weights in them. And because of that, the neural nets are really black boxes. We don't understand what's going on inside of them. And while their accuracy might look fantastic, I mean, maybe they appear to read radiology reports more accurately than humans do, we don't actually know what they're doing inside or what kind of mistakes they might make. So we're going to talk a little bit more about that so you understand some of the risks that are involved in the technology. So the bottom line is going to be that friends shouldn't let friends sort of blindly deploy these black box models in some settings without being able to better understand what's going on inside. And I'm going to tell you why and how I got involved in this. So years ago, we trained a neural net on a pneumonia risk problem. So imagine that all of you have been diagnosed with pneumonia. And the goal of this model is to figure out which of you are high risk or low risk. And if you're high risk, you absolutely should be in the hospital or even the critical care unit because a large percentage, maybe 10% of patients with pneumonia die from it. But if you're low risk, the proper treatment really is as an outpatient. Chicken soup, antibiotics, call us in a few days if you're not feeling better. Because a hospital is a bad place to be if you don't have to be there. Now, the most accurate model, perhaps not surprisingly, that we could train on the data turned out to be a complex neural net with 100 million weights in it. And the question was, should we go ahead and consider using this neural net on real people? Now, it turned out we were afraid to do that, to use the neural net on real people, and I'm going to tell you why. So a person who was doing rule-based learning, that's a different kind of learning, that's not neural nets, on exactly the same data, learned a rule which was, if you have a history of asthma, you're actually at less chance of dying from pneumonia. That is, asthma seems to be good for you if you have pneumonia. So, and hopefully that sounds a little bit questionable. Now, we asked the doctors, and the doctors said, well, first of all, we consider asthma a terrible risk factor if you've got pneumonia. So we don't want your model to predict that asthma is good for you. But it's probably a true pattern in the data. And if you think about it, asthmatics pay a lot of attention to how they're breathing. They probably notice the symptoms of pneumonia earlier. They have a doctor who treats their pneumonia, so they know who to call. They're already plugged into healthcare. They get an appointment, they get diagnosed, and then they get treatment quickly because the doctors know that this is an asthmatic patient and they consider pneumonia and asthma a very bad combination. So they get really good treatment. So this is a magic combination if you have an infection, which is you notice the symptoms early, you get to health care early, and you get treatment early. For infections, that's a wonderful thing. Now, we just assume that if the rule-based system on this data set learned this pattern, that the neural net must have learned it as well, because the neural net is actually better than the rule-based system. It's more sensitive. So we know this is sitting inside the neural net. Now, once we know it's there, we probably could fix it and make that neural net safe to deploy. The reason why we didn't want to use the neural net, why we were afraid of using it on people, is what else might the neural net have learned that was similarly risky, like thinking that asthma is good for you if you have pneumonia, but something else intelligible, like a rule-based system, didn't learn this pattern and tell us that we needed to fix something else. So I'm going to show you that there are some other things in the neural net that we should be afraid of. So now all we would need to solve this problem would be something that was very intelligible, say like linear regression, but as accurate as the neural net. Then we'd be good to go. But as many of you might know, there tends to be a trade-off in machine learning between accuracy and intelligibility. The most accurate models in the upper left there tend not to be very intelligible, and the more intelligible models on the bottom right tend to be less accurate. So what we're looking for is some magic thing in this upper right-hand corner. That's the holy grail, something that's both accurate and intelligible. And the surprise is we've had some success at developing methods now that sit in that corner. They're not good for everything, but they are actually useful for a number of things. And we've now gone and used these models on problems like pneumonia and others. And I'm just going to tell you some of the things we learned by using these models. So first of all, it does learn that asthma looks like it lowers risk. That's a real pattern in the data, so we expect that. Interestingly, it learns that patients who are over 85 get less care than patients who are under 85. And we think that's because in data from the early 90s, these patients are treated as being very elderly. And maybe we're not going to treat them as aggressively as we would young patients. Surprisingly, though, it seems to learn that patients who are over 100 really get very aggressive treatment, because if you've made it that far, we're going to sort of fight even harder to get you another year. So the trick is to get over 100 without going through 85. Now, there's something even more surprising, though. This is the most worrisome thing of all, is the model has also learned that having a history of heart disease and chest pain is actually good for you. If you've got pneumonia, it would be great if you had had a heart attack 2 years earlier. Now, we think this is exactly the same as the asthma setting. If you've had a heart attack, you're paying a lot of attention to how your breathing and your chest feels. If you start getting the symptoms of pneumonia, you notice right away. You're on the phone or there's an ambulance in your driveway very, very quickly, and you get to care rapidly. And then the good news is they tell you you're not having a heart attack, you only have pneumonia, and they give you treatment, and rapid treatment is, of course, a wonderful thing. Now, it's really good that we didn't deploy that neural net that we trained a while ago on this data set, because we didn't know that these things were in the neural net. But now that we have these intelligible models, we can see these things. We know they're in the data set, so any smart enough model trained on this data would learn these things. And with this new class of models, we're able to not only see these things, but we can sort of fix them. We can have experts like doctors look at the model, see all the many good things that it's learned, but also see a few problems like these heart disease and asthma effects, and repair the model and then deploy it. Now, here's a surprising thing, which is you might think we could fix some of these problems by just removing the variables like asthma and heart disease so that the model doesn't know that you're an asthmatic or a heart disease patient. And it turns out that's a bad idea. So if you've had heart disease, that's correlated with other things we know about you, such as your age, your blood pressure, whether you have diabetes, and things like this. So it turns out the model will still learn to predict that people who are likely to have had heart disease are lower risk. So it'll still get its fix on these things, even though you didn't include the variables. So now with these new interpretable models, the trick is definitely keep protected variables like asthma, heart disease, or race and gender in the model, and make sure that the model can learn to be as biased as possible on those variables. And then you can see it localized and then try to repair it. Okay, so now we've started using these models for things other than healthcare. So many of you have probably heard of the COMPASS model, which is used in some places in the United States to predict future criminal activity. And there's been a number of papers that have reported that this model is probably racially biased. So what we've done is we're able to use these intelligible models, and we don't have access to the COMPAS model. It's a black box. It's protected by IP. So we can't see what's inside it. But what we can do is we can train an intelligible model to mimic the COMPAS model. So we've done that, and we've learned a number of interesting things. And I'll just mention some of the findings and then wrap up. First of all, as reported by others, COMPAS does appear to be somewhat racially biased. And in fact, it appears to be more biased than the training data suggests it should be. So there does appear to be a problem, as other people have reported. The most important variable in COMPAS seems to be the number of prior convictions, and that's good because that's a very strong variable that judges would have taken into account anyway. The model does not appear to do a very good job on handling age and gender, so it doesn't seem to be complex enough to do it properly. And in fact, our analysis suggests that the model is actually quite simple, and maybe it's too simple. And just last week, North Point announced that, in fact, the model only uses 6 variables. Although they collect over 150 variables when they do a questionnaire, they only use a handful of these variables in the model, and that's consistent with what we're finding. And the good news is that we now have techniques which allow us to sort of try to pry open these black box models and see what's inside of them, even if we don't have access to the internals of the model. So just to wrap up, all data sets, in my experience, are biased one way or another. In healthcare, this bias might be on features like asthma and heart disease. In social justice settings, these might be things like race bias, gender bias, or age bias. But my experience is every data set has these problems lurking in it of one form or another. And because machine learning just learns what's in the data, that means the model trained on the data is going to be biased as well. So we have to learn to do something. So one way to approach this is to just be able to understand the model that you've trained and what you're going to use it for so that you can see the bias and probably fix it. Fortunately, we now have methods for training models that are very intelligible and accurate, so that's great. And more work is being done every day on this area. We now can use some of these techniques to even try to open up black box models that we're not able to see the inside of, perhaps because they're protected by IP. And the amazing thing is you often find problems that you never would have anticipated in advance. So I think we all know to look for race or gender bias in a model, but often you can find other kinds of bias in these models. And then to our surprise, it turns out it's very important to keep protected variables, things you're afraid of. It's very important sometimes to keep these in the model so that the model will learn the bias that's in the data, and then you can see the bias that it has learned, and then you can fix it after the fact. If you sort of hide the variables, then the bias ends up spreading through the model in a complex way that's very hard to fix. Okay, so that's it. Thank you.
Thank you. Brent?
Okay, so thank you very much for having me on the panel. So what I'm going to talk about is transparency and algorithmic accountability, focusing a bit on the GDPR, but actually how we can go beyond the GDPR and reach sort of a higher ethical standard than what is actually set by the requirements of the GDPR. I'm sure everybody in the room has heard countless calls for transparency in algorithms and AI. And while those are fine, quite often what they're missing is a statement on what the purpose of transparency is, what the goal of transparency is, what it's supposed to let you do. And to me, it doesn't make much sense to talk about transparency without also talking about its purpose, because if you do, then you may end up just giving people information that is not meaningful or not useful to them in any way. So what I'm going to describe is one particular approach to transparency in algorithmic systems that focuses on how you can empower the data subject without exposing other data subjects to undue risks, so privacy risks, and also without taking too much away from data controllers if they're using a proprietary system or other data sets that are subject to trade secrets, or basically without going too far in the other direction, trying to find sort of a healthy middle ground. So the sorts of questions that interest me and the type of case that I'm thinking of when I'm talking about AI or automated decision making would be something like this, which is a story about the value-added model in the US, essentially a set of algorithms used to evaluate the performance of teachers. There were cases in it, I think in Houston, teachers brought a case where essentially they wanted access to the system, or they wanted some explanation of how the system worked so that they could actually verify that the scores that they were receiving were accurate and make changes to how they were teaching, or just introduce new data that would then change their score. And also, of course, the case that Rich mentioned, the Compass case, would be another type of case that I think is interesting, or at least relevant for what I'll be describing. So in terms of the GDPR, there are a number of provisions in it that introduce some sort of accountability or transparency requirements for AI or for automated decision making. But quite often they're either weak or non-binding, or they just don't go far enough. They're limited, or too limited, I would say. So we have the principles of fairness and transparency in Article 5, but in a number of cases, the provisions that are related to those principles are non-binding. So a good example of that is the right to explanation. Again, it's in a non-binding recital rather than a safeguard in Article 22, which would have made it binding. Another is how automated decision-making is defined. So it has to be a decision based solely on automated processing with legal or similarly significant effects. That sort of narrows down the range of decisions or types of systems that would actually be subject or fall within the definition of automated decision-making in the GDPR. And of course, the Article 29 Working Party is giving us some clarity on what those terms actually mean, which is very useful. But even with I suppose, a slightly broader definition than what I was expecting, which was encouraging, those terms do still limit the scope of automated decision-making quite a bit. And also, there's really no legal requirement to open the black box, so to speak. Explanations are only mentioned in Recital 71. There's no definition, there's no requirements. There's another phrase in Article 15, well, Articles 13 through 15, which is about giving meaningful information about the logic involved in automated decision-making, meaningful information about the envisaged consequences and significance. And the problem there is that what's really being referred to is a meaningful overview of how automated decision-making works in practice. So it's not really talking about information about how a specific decision about you was reached, which I think would be the most useful kind of explanation or useful kind of transparency, but rather some high-level overview of how the system functions, what it's supposed to do, what sort of data it takes into account, and so forth. So the question I'm interested in is really, if you did want to provide an explanation of automated decision to a person, what would be the requirements for that? Would you want a global or local explanation? What level of complexity would be appropriate, and how do these requirements change based on the audience? And what information in particular would you want? Is the source code enough? Probably not going to be meaningful to many people. Do you want to know what the input data is, what features were particularly important in the decision, and so forth? And so the approach I'm going to describe is based on the idea of giving counterfactual explanations of specific automated decisions. This is a paper that will be coming out in the Harvard Journal of Law and Technology. So in the paper, we actually describe a method, and we give some examples. We run some test cases to show how the method actually works in practice. But what I'll be covering with you is basically a definition of a high-level definition of the method and why I think it's a good approach to transparency. So the basic idea is that a counterfactual explanation would be a statement that takes the form, score P or decision P was returned because a set of variables V had values V1, V2 associated with them. If that set of variables had different values assigned to it, so V1 prime, V2 prime, and other variables remain constant, then score P prime would have been returned. So essentially, if a set of variables had different values to them, then a different decision would have been returned to you. So an example here is you were denied a loan because your annual income was £30,000. If your income had been £45,000, you would have been offered the loan. So you know what decision you wanted, you know what output you actually wanted. You wanted to get the loan, and we're going to tell you changes that could have occurred that would have resulted in you getting that decision. So there are a number of advantages of counterfactuals. One is that you can calculate multiple counterfactuals or multiple different ways to change or to get to the decision you actually wanted. You can calculate sets of counterfactuals or counterfactuals that involve interactions or dependencies between multiple variables, so this isn't just for single variables. And essentially it's a way of giving explanations that I think bridges the gap between what's being done in computer science, which is quite often about knowing the weights of different variables, things that are useful more for debugging or designing systems, versus what we want in ethics or law, which is more about an assessment of the acceptability of the decision and the lawfulness of the decision. They can be generated even if you're using very complex methods. Again, we have the code running already. We know that it works. There's no need to actually understand the internal logic of the algorithm or the black box. And it's less likely to infringe the rights and freedoms of others because, again, you're just giving simple statements of the form that I showed you before. And so I think that counterfactuals link quite well with three different goals of explanations for individuals. And again, we're taking the perspective of what information would be useful to a data subject, what information would be useful to the person subjected to the decision. So on the one hand, they can help you understand how the decision was made. They reveal something about the logic and the key variables in a decision. And again, we can give you lots of counterfactuals which deal with different variables. They can help you challenge decisions. You have the right to contest automated decisions under Article 22.3 in the GDPR. And so we're going to give you, again, some indication of the variables that were important. And finally, they may be able to help you alter future decisions by changing your behavior. They reveal what would be needed to get a different or a desired result. And there will be some limitations on sort of how good or how long-term that advice actually is. But they do give you some basis to go off of if you're looking for to change your behavior. And so finally, our proposal is essentially to give unconditional counterfactual explanations. This would mean counterfactual explanations not subject to the limitations of the GDPR, not subject to the definition of automated decision-making in the GDPR. And I think it's a good way to provide accountability and transparency in some cases while striking a fair balance between data subjects and data controllers' interests. And going forward, what we need to work on, or what we're going to work on next, is to decide what counts as a sufficient set of counterfactuals in different decision-making contexts. And some of that may be based on what is a close possible world in different contexts. It may be, for example, that it has to be a possible world, the emphasis on possible world. So we're going to give you information about variables that you as an individual would actually have some control over. So I'll end there. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Brent. There's so much content here and, of course, so little time. Let me throw out a question that I think will link together Professor Benanti's, all the presentations were great, but your presentation and Jim, your presentation. You both, I think, are talking about developing a kind of universal algo-ethics or some frame for dealing with the ethical issues around algorithms. Is this going to be possible in the world in which we live? I understand you are talking about sort of the, what is ideal, but given the contentiousness just around things like how do we share data, how do we communicate about that, looking at the differences between a GDPR system and a US system, what I'm wondering is, do you feel optimistic or pessimistic about this? Would you like to begin, Professor Benanti?
Let's look at something that happened in the past. According to European Union, a worker that works with a machine, for example, an automatic hammer or something like that, to protect the human being, the machine has to pass an independent test that is a quality test. So we can imagine to have an independent test that certify that this kind of Algor-ethics algorithm give a compatible answer to some situation. It's not perfect. But something in the past already give a certain grade of sureness on machine. So we have to imagine an analogous way to draft a similar things. But the first and the core point is to left to the human being the decision in which the machine can say, I'm uncertain. So if we put this inside the machine, we never subtract to the human being the core place of having a judge in complicated situation.
Jim, what do you think? You optimistic or pessimistic?
Such an interesting question. So, optimistic, pessimistic, is it possible at all to develop an ethical frame? I'm really inspired by the counterfactual move. So, what would be the alternative to yes or no developing an ethical frame? An interesting laissez-faire where who exactly would be making those decisions? So I think it's a great question because it really shows that this is something we must do. The good news, however, is that it's not for some committee or some particular organization to develop this. Evidently, it is something which we must do jointly because of the particular nature of values that can be considered as something untouchable, sacred, and stable, and are in fact, as we know, and all four presentations touched on that, are very ethereal, difficult to grasp, diverse. So we need a public deliberation on this, and this is the way to go. No, it's really a great question.
Well, and I completely embrace what you said, and I love the counterfactual scenarios, and I'm going to come back to that in a moment. But in many ways, the issue really is, well, if we don't, then what? And that brings me to some of your discussion, Rich. I mean, you talked about the fact that all data sets are biased. And of course that's true, but we know humans are biased as well. And my thinking, and I've talked to lots of computer scientists, is, yes, we absolutely need to deal with some of the difficulties around algorithms, but they're so much better than humans on their own. And often have so much more to add in terms of trying to bring some objectivity to decision making. But what I'm wondering in terms of your presentation is you talk about, look, you're incredibly advanced computer scientist. You get to spend a lot of time looking at when data sets are appropriate, when decisions may be off kilter, when we have too much noise and not enough signal, is really what you get to spend your time doing. But what I think some people are worried about is that not every company has someone like you sitting around able to say, okay, those are the results we're getting, but actually they're off and they're skewed, and we need to get to the signal rather than the noise. So even though you're a data scientist, you're not a policy person. You can play one on TV for a moment. What would you say to individuals who are deeply concerned that there are going to be a lot of folks using algorithmic models to make decisions, and they're not going to have the ability, the time, or the interest, or the money to really dive into separating out that signal from the noise?
Right, so I think there's at least two issues here. One is just basic education. As I said in the beginning of the presentation, there's just a surprising number of people in artificial intelligence and machine learning who really think that accuracy is all that counts. And then if the accuracy is high enough, then the model must be good and trustworthy and safe to use. And what we're finding is, as you said, the models can be objective, which is great, and they can be very accurate, but they can also be making a surprising number of mistakes that humans would never make. So part of the job is just education. That is just showing people the surprising ways in which these models can be falling down on the job, despite the fact that overall they have very high accuracy, but they have these blind spots. And they're very different blind spots than the kind of blind spots that humans have. Like, I mean, everybody in the room, when you hear that heart disease and asthma are good for you if you have pneumonia, thinks that's kind of crazy. But unfortunately, the machine learning algorithm didn't think that was kind of crazy. It just saw the pattern in the data and went ahead and did it. But beyond the education, just so that people know they need to look for these things, that these landmines are hiding in the data and therefore will be in the model that's trained on the data, we need a set of standard practices. So you might have thought that the decision to sort of protect certain variables like race and gender would protect people from having models that would be biased. And unfortunately, the real world is more complicated than this. And that's not the way it works. If you hide these variables, the models will still be biased. It just won't be so obvious that they're biased. So we really need a number of standard practices where if you're looking for bias, you go run this test. And if you run this test and you get this result, then you have something you have to further investigate. And if you get a clean bill of health when you run that test, then it means you're probably safe to go ahead. And these are things where I wish I could say I knew what these standard practices and tests should be right now. I could probably give you some of them. That would be a good thing to run. And I'm sure a year or two from now, we'll actually have better tests, and then 5 years, even better tests. So it's a new field. The techniques that we need to use to sort of examine these models and evaluate them are just all being developed now. But we would have to have these sort of standard practices, and you would have to have requirements that this company would just have to run certain evaluations on their model before deploying it in certain kinds of mission-critical domains. So I think there's no way around. We already have this in like credit lending. There's been a long series of regulations that have grown up over 30 or 40 years in parallel with the scoring community. And we need that now for other things like the justice system or using models to process resumes and in healthcare. Right. So.
And great response. And that leads me to my question for you, Brent. There is a lot of history to very simplistic algorithms. As Rich just mentioned, in the credit reporting, credit scoring area, we've been dealing with this for decades. And I love your notion of going beyond what in the United States is called an adverse action letter. When you get a negative response, you're told what was the data that was at issue. And I think that is a quite usable piece of information, because then consumers can at least know, well, was it accurate or not? You said I only earned 30,000 pounds. Actually, I earned more than that, and so you can correct your record. But you're talking about going beyond what is done in the United States, and in a limited number of circumstances, for a limited number of decisions, and actually giving examples of, what would have led you to get to a different result. So that makes a lot of sense in like a credit area, maybe even a housing area. How would that translate to a justice algorithm? How would that translate to the kind of algorithm that Rich was talking about, where you're talking to individuals and saying, well, we would have, you would have only gotten probation, but for X, Y, and Z, or if you, grew up in a different, you had a different set of what would be those factors that would lead someone to a very different result in a justice system? Might be so complex, might be every experience that they had since the moment that they were born. How explainable is something like that in your view?
Can I add something to that?
Because please, of course.
Yeah, very, very small. So what you're after is whether the model is right, is getting the rules that are coming out of it are right. Let's skip the accuracy. What you're after is what was the decision, what was the rule? And I think that's something different. So could you respond to that also? Because it's very relevant for the questions that you asked.
Yeah, so I completely agree with the distinction. By definition, we would only be able to tell you about changes to variables that have been observed. So things that the decision could have actually been based on. So if we're not able to have, your entire, the entire history of your life represented in the data set, then we're not going to be able to tell you much about that. If instead, let's say that we have information on your criminal history, or where you live, or other people you know, as would be relevant in the case of Compass, then we will be able to tell you something, not necessarily, it's not going to be something you can change because it's part of your past, but at the very least you're able to understand, okay, that's one of the reasons why the decision went against me. So it says nothing about whether the model is justifiable or sort of ethically correct. It's just literally, it can give you some basis to question that. So for example, if I tell you that the decision was actually, or that ethnicity was a important variable to the decision, in the sense that if you were a different ethnicity, the decision would have changed, then that gives you some basis to criticize the rightness of the model, the fact that it's even using that variable in the first place. So the two things are related, but again, by definition, we're only able to tell you about variables that are contained within the data set that is available to the model.
So many interesting issues in just that answer. Like, for instance, let's say you are told that it was your ethnicity. Under the GDPR, what do you get to do about that? You're told, but if there isn't enough of a substantive core that would prohibit that kind of an unfair decision, I wonder if you're going to wind up with a society that is deeply frustrated and unable to do anything about these issues. But in any event, let's move on. Should we take a couple of questions?
Yeah, let's just take, I'm going to take 2 questions because we are actually running out of time. I'm going to take 2 questions. First, you and you. First you, yeah. Can you come up and introduce yourself briefly? Yes.
Hi, Silvia De Conca from Tilburg Institute of Law, Technology and Society. First of all, really happy, Rich, you dropped the assumption, because as an asthmatic person with 3 pneumonias in the past, don't follow that. But not accurate at all. But I wanted to say, you have discussed how we can embed the meaning, the final purpose of the human, or how can the algorithm somehow adapt to that? And I really actually appreciated the 4 possible, I don't remember the term now, directions. But we not only have that one. So you were saying, there is the developers say if there is accuracy, they think it's fine. Well, we also have other actors. We have companies. The will and the interest of the company is not human, and the assumption that the companies will act ethically or that they will do what's best for humans. No, the companies, remember, sociopaths for us. They have their own interest, and the algorithm might actually adapt to theirs. So I believe this is not a 2 actors interaction, it's a 3 actors, or even 4 if we consider sometimes governments. And I would like to know from the panelists if they actually have considered also that the scenario might be actually more complicated than that, with more interests. And just very quickly, that there might be an issue of semantics. If mathematicians think that accuracy is fine, and we think that we need a different language and semantics.
Okay, thank you. Second question, the person who's, yes. Please keep it.
Tobias Mauschutz from Datenschutzraum. My question goes in the same direction, I think. The question is, we are talking often about the right decision or wrong decision, but most times it's more like many shades of gray, where we have a lot of different interests, a lot of different conflicts, and there is no right or wrong, but different interests that have to be balanced.
Okay, can I have a brief response? Who first would like to respond? Rich?
So one thing that is critical is knowing what you're going to use the predictions that come out of these models for. And there's, as suggested in both comments, there's a big difference between laboratory accuracy and then accuracy when you go and use the model for some purpose in the real world. And of course, we're really only interested in the accuracy in the real world when we're using the model, but we can't typically measure that in the laboratory. And you don't want to just sort of deploy the model and see how it goes and then pull it back if it's making big mistakes. You'd like to fix it sort of before that happens. So it's critical to have some understanding of what you think the model will be used for. And that definitely informs whether you believe the model is good enough as it is, or whether some things need to be fixed. So having an understanding of how the predictions are going to be used is a very, very important part of this process. And that's where the machine learning algorithms, the artificial intelligence that we have right now, it doesn't typically know how this thing is going to be used. It's just in a laboratory setting that it's being optimized. And there's a tendency that the company will optimize it in a way that looks favorable for the company's objectives. But then once it's deployed, it's a whole different world. So by creating this interpretability in the models, we're hoping that when you can see what's in the model and have an idea of how it's going to be used in the wild, you then have a better chance of sort of finding the things that look good and bad in the model with respect to that intended use. So that's very important.
Okay, you want to go into
Yeah, sure. Very briefly. So interesting, right decision, wrong decision. Accuracy is one aspect. But then what about fairness? What about meaning? So this whole discussion on artificial intelligence and use of algorithmic models also enables us to take a step back and have a think about what forms of power, control, who decides in our societies, and what matters most to us. Accuracy, fairness, what is meaningful. There you go.
Thank you. I think it's also interesting, and this relates to your question, I think, that you ended with, to make a difference between explanation of a decision based on the algorithms, etc., and justification of the decision. By explaining it, you are not justifying it. So if there is ethnicity under European law, there are many other laws that give you the right to object to that. So sometimes focusing all our attention on explanation is dangerous because we forget that whatever decision the system takes, it might have to be justified. I'm taking two more questions. Yes? Okay, these two. Please keep them very brief. I'm getting algorithmically uncertain about the ending time because actually
we haven't heard a bell yet,
Yeah,
so we
so
should
we're
we're just going to
confused.
keep going, guys, until we hear a bell.
Exactly. So
Okay.
please, but
Thank
still
you.
keep it brief, please.
Andrew Adams, Meiji University. I want to follow up again. I'm asthmatic, so the counterfactual there was interesting. One of the issues on the counterfactuals, of course, is it shows you where your data's wrong. And in that case, it showed you that you're not getting the right source of data. You're not getting how early people are presenting. You're not getting how quickly they're being treated. But this also leads into the issue of where the policy comes, which is many of these decisions have feedback loops that we have to be assured that when they are put into practice, that there is an understanding of how the feedback loop will affect the decision making and affect the algorithm's use in the future. And that's where the policy comes in, that we need the policy, I think, to say, you've got to take these into account when you're deciding to deploy these and keep an eye on it and see what happens going forward on those.
Okay, thank you. Are you specifically asking this question to Rich or Brent? Okay. Second question, remember this one.
Christian Jeffer from the Humboldt Institute of Internet and Society in Berlin. Brief question, is there a genuine ethical struggle in artificial intelligence as it exists today? I concur with many of the panelists that we have a lot of questions, open questions, how we should design technology, but then almost everything is an ethical question. So is there something where we really say we don't know what's good and what's bad in the face of the technologies as they exist today? And a follow-up, which I would address to Mr. Dratwa, excellent presentation. And you have so much experience. My question would be, why don't we trust the political process? Because in a way, at the moment, we are looking at values, we are designing big processes of participation, and the democratic process is in a way has the goal to have decisions of the people, what they think is good and just. So why don't we trust politics?
Okay, let's first hear Brent.
So yeah, I'll respond to the questions, backwards. So on whether there are genuine ethical struggles, I think there are. The one that I'm particularly interested in is there has to be some sort of discussion around what sort of tasks or what sort of decision-making contexts we're comfortable with using opaque or autonomous decision-making systems. So we have that around autonomous weapons, for example. It's a very clear place where there's a discussion about whether it's ethically acceptable or not. But I suppose I'm more interested in using automated systems or highly complex systems that we understand poorly just to know things about people, to infer things about people, and basically making a decision as a society. We accept the fact that we can't understand how this system works, but we're comfortable with using it. That we accept, in other words, we accept the opacity because the accuracy is so much higher, the efficiency is so much higher. Quite often that dialogue is driven not by what is right or what we want, but rather what is possible. And so I think that is a genuine ethical struggle that it's not necessarily something we've dealt with particularly well just yet. On the first question with the counterfactuals, one thing I didn't mention is that if it does point out to you where the data is wrong or where you have the wrong value for a variable, that can actually be very helpful with the feedback loop between data controller and data subject for the right to rectification. Because right now the data subject doesn't get any information about what variables were key or what section of the data, the record that the data controller has, was actually important for the decision. So we're at the very least able to tell you what was important or what was influential on it, and if you notice that there's a wrong value in there, then you can request that that be rectified. So that it does contribute to the right to rectification in some sense.
Okay, thank you. I think the next question was particularly for Jim.
Thanks. Two great questions, really. So specifically on the ethical struggle and the role of the political process. I'm sure we'd love to talk more about what is ethics, because that's really the crucial thing here. And let me be very brief. Briefer still. Ethics is the search for the good, but is it the good action? Is it the good life? Is it the good society? Is it broadening it to the question of really what world we want to live in together? So not power structures in society who will decide instead of other people what is good and what is bad. Democracy in itself also is faced with the same sort of dilemma. We could decide that other people will decide in our stead, or we may, in some particular cases, want to engage in this deliberation. Ethics is a wide spectrum, and on the one hand, you have compliance with the law, with rules and regulations, with codes and agreements, and then you arrive at questions of data protection and privacy. Then at some point you reach a clouded peak, or perhaps a crevice, questions of humanness, naturalness, godliness, questions about human values, common good, the foundations crumbling, or perhaps to be refined. But then let's not forget that at the far end of this wide spectrum that is ethics, there is the question of what world we want to live in together.
Julie.
I just want to ask the panelists, I'm a very practical person, and so all these questions have been wonderful in terms of teasing out theories, but if we really want to get down to brass tacks, what can we do to ensure that companies and others that are operating algorithms are behaving in an ethical way? I've heard things like having computer scientists not just get trained, but actually take something on the equivalent of a Hippocratic oath. That we shall only use algorithms for good, and we shall do the kind of testing that Rich has described, et cetera, et cetera. Or what about something like taking the concept of DPIAs, data protection impact assessments, and creating algorithmic impact assessments, so that you're not just looking at the confines of the GDPR, which I think are really missing some of these values that need to be discussed, and you broaden it to an actual impact assessment that needs to be made with respect to the algorithm. So, Professor Benanti, you've been somewhat quiet during the question and answer. Do you have any thoughts? Hippocratic oath for computer scientists, algorithmic impact assessment. Rich, I'm sure you've thought about these things. Brent as well, please. And Jim, of course.
Okay, I'll try to be a little bit unpolite.
Go for it, sure.
Albert Einstein was used to say that the same thinking that creates a problem cannot give the solution. So according to my perspective, we have to try to think outside of the box. Think outside of the box. Let's suggest us that it's not just a problem of computer science. It's a society problem. Now, let me try to explain it with a short example. Some kind of decision are made by special people. Decision on justice by judge. Decision on health by doctors. Now, some machine can make the same decision now. And we start to dig in why we allow someone to take that kind of decision. That is the ethical background. And we just discovered something that was true, but was in our unconscious, that a judge can decide based on his commitment on that profession. Now that a machine can do the same things, I was too much impolite. Now, the problem is the quality of the judgment. And this is just not a problem of computer science, ethicists, or legal. It's a broad humanity problem.
I think it would be very good if everybody gives a brief response, because I think this is an important question, just 1 minute.
Sure.
1 sentence.
Oh, one sentence.
Yes, because the final bell has rung.
The final bell has rung.
So I suppose I would connect with some stuff that Rich has said. I think having strong certification and auditing standards for these systems is very important, and critically, they need to not be something that just comes from industry self-regulation, but actually have external actors involved in defining them as well.
Thank you. Jim.
Yeah. This important point about ethics and the law. We need a very strong regulatory system, and that's what we're going towards. And at the same time, we need to think what escapes that. What is not external coercion, but what are the values that we are holding dear as individuals and as we engage in public deliberation as a society?
Thank you, Rich.
I think it's definitely a mistake to leave the ethics and the impact on society up to engineers like me. But what we can do is we can develop tools and practices which give people the power to understand what the models are doing so that other people can then decide what are the things we want to deploy for society or not deploy. So, but there's a separation, sort of between church and state here where the technology sort of has to be developed so that we can then answer or even ask these very hard questions. But then what to do with it, that's a separate question. So.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much for fantastic questions from the audience. Thank you very much for our moderators, speakers. And this is the end.